Again, I've already mentioned in the prior meeting, Mayor Lord will not be attending tonight's meeting. We have one item on tonight's work session. Council will receive an overview of the ambulance service feasibility study, which was conducted by the James Vincent Group, Scottsdale, Arizona, and I guess Paul Louisi, you're going to do the present?
Yes, sir.
You're on.
Okay. Good evening, Mayor and Council. Tonight we're going to talk to you about the feasibility study that was conducted by the James Vincent Group. Tonight with me is Gabe Boldra, is the principal from the James Vincent Group. We also have Roy Riles here. He's a subject matter expert in the ambulance industry and also working along with the James Vincent Group. And then obviously we have our finance director, esteemed finance director, Larry Lang. Okay. So a little bit of background. Over the last 2.5 years, the ambulance industry in Arizona has gone through some tumultuous changes, including a bankruptcy filing by our contracted ambulance provider in August of 2013. As such, it's forced the city of Goodyear to look at options to provide the highest level of continuous emergency ambulance transport services to our citizens. After meeting with the director of Department of Health Services in the fall of 2013, there was an obvious need from that conversation to have more government entities being able to provide emergency transport services in the state of Arizona. In order to be good stewards of our money and the citizens' money, the fire department and city manager felt that it was important to fully understand all the financial nuances of applying for a certificate of need, or a CON, which gives the city full authority to transport patients and subsequently bill healthcare insurances for services rendered. So during that time, the city entered into an RFP process to complete an ambulance feasibility study. We had a group that represented employees from the fire department, from the finance department, and we also had the assistant chief financial officer from West Valley Hospital helping us out select the vendor. The committee recommended the James Vincent Group from Scottsdale, who were selected to complete the study. They began their work in February. And the scope of this work will include to understand insurance payer mix, collection rate, transport fees, provide a cost-benefit analysis of the transport services owned and operated by the fire department, gather and compile startup and operating costs, projected transports, and make recommendations on the feasibility and sustainability of this project. Comparison of economic pros and cons between recommended options in maintaining the status quo as we are today, and lastly, to develop a comprehensive 5-year financial outlook of adding this proposed service to the city. To fund this study, it was paid for out of the city manager's contingency fund. And as you can see, there were the 3 models that we looked at: the advanced life support, the basic life support service, the ALS transport only model, which would use Southwest Ambulance as a backup vendor for us, and then maintaining the status quo. And all along, we've priced out this study to include civilian EMT and paramedic employees that would be added into the fire department. And there's an overview of the scope of work that we looked at. Again, as we went through the study, we had constant communication with the James Vincent Group on all of these aspects of this feasibility study. The current regulatory environment, as you know, this CON is a fully regulated ambulance industry that is overseen by the Department of Health Services. It regulates every aspect of these services in the state. Currently, 2 vendors hold the CON authorization to operate in Goodyear. You have Southwest Ambulance, Rural Metro, who is their parent company, and then you have American Medical Response, AMR, which was newly awarded a CON earlier this year. In the past legislative session, House Bill 2588 was introduced in this year's first regular session. This would have allowed cities and towns and fire districts to obtain a CON in 30 days, as opposed to most points that have been introduced in the past were up to 2 years for a CON to be obtained. The bill was not passed. Still, the interest in modifying the current process exists, both in the legislative body and also for the stakeholders out there. And then, again, the current process can take up to 450 days.
1 second there, Bill.
Chief, I've got couple of questions on this one. That House Bill 2588 died this year.
Yes, the bill was not passed.
I don't think even got a Senate hearing.
It did not get the hearing, but there is quite a bit of interest in this bill from both the legislative and also the stakeholders.
Is it a fair representation to say that there was great interest in it if it never made it to a Senate hearing? The reason that I believe that it didn't make it to a hearing is that there was a lot of question about the wording in 2588.
Oh, absolutely.
So should we necessarily be representing it as though there's a lot of interest behind getting it?
I wanted to make sure that council understood what was out there from a legislative standpoint, and if they had heard about this House bill, that they did understand and it did not pass. But I also, from a stakeholder standpoint, I do know that there still is some interest out there.
All right. Second question on this particular slide is isn't there a third provider currently seeking a C of N to cover this area? Right now it's Southwest and AMR. Isn't there a third provider?
There is a company named Priority Ambulance that has an interest in seeking a CON, but to date, there's been no hearing scheduled and there has been no application submitted that I know of.
Okay, I don't want to correct you, but there is an application. There is one set forward, and there is a hearing that's planned for later this year, I think in August.
Okay.
For that. So given the fact that there's already 2 existing C of Ns in this particular area and the potential for a third one, what is the likelihood that a fourth one would actually be awarded in this particular area?
I know from our discussions with the director, now this was almost a year and a half ago, 18 months ago, there was a strong interest in having more government entities and bodies involved in the CON application process and subsequent awarding of CONs. The current environment now has changed, and I'm not sure how that would be perceived by the interim director.
Yeah, and the director's changed as well.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
So back to this bill. So it didn't pass, and
Correct.
it was asked to be able to. The whole purpose of it was to allow cities and towns to only have 30 days to be able to bring this into fruition, rather than 450 days. Correct? Is that what? I don't know
that was the
anything
intent.
about this bill. So.
Yeah, that was really the intent of the bill, was to help speed along the process. It was seen as, a process that was drug out, sometimes upwards of 2 years. And obviously, once you start to drag it out that amount of time, it's going to start costing the cities, towns, fire districts, or whoever's applying a considerable amount of money, because you're paying consultants.
Well,
for that.
that's just a huge change of 30 days to 400, from 450 days to 30
Right.
days. So what was the reasoning why it didn't really pass anything? What was the point? What were the legislators concerned about?
I don't think it was the legislators necessarily. I think it was more of the other private interests in this bill. I think they were concerned that the way the wording was, as Councilmember Stipp alluded to allow the cities, towns, and fire districts to obtain that CON in a much faster process, they kind of felt like they'd be pushed out, a private entity. So,
Okay, that was it. Thank you.
I have a question on kind of how this all works. Because you said there's 2 that have basically contracts in the Goodyear area.
Correct.
And if we went in there, how do we supplant? Does one go away, or how does that work? How do you get the calls? How does that work with the private ambulance?
They would still maintain their CON. That would not change. We would either negotiate with the other 2 CON providers to see who is going to be the primary provider of the transports in the city, or we would come to some other agreement, whether we split calls with them, where the Goodyear Fire Department would do the advanced life support transports, or the private provider would do the BLS, basic life support emergency transports, and then also the interfacility work. So there would have to be some agreement between the 2. Currently, the way the other cities, when they're applying for a CON, the way that the other 2 vendors are reacting to that are protesting the application. So it makes it go to a hearing. Administrative law judge will oversee the hearing at that point and then make a recommendation. recommendation.
And let's say we did get one, and then there's the other two here. From what Councilmember Stipp says, there's maybe another one. How do you divide the calls so that it can be financially profitable? Because we obviously don't want to do a losing venture. So
No.
I guess I don't see how that works. I'm not sure how we get in line for calls or how that works. I'm sorry, I don't mean to ask a stupid question.
No,
I
it's
just don't get
actually
that.
not, it's not. It's an excellent question. Honestly, it would go down to the negotiations about
Okay.
who's going to be the primary provider.
And if we can't agree,
I'm not sure. I'll have to ask Roy how the state would rule in that instance, but
okay.
the intent into going into the CON process is that the entity entering into that would at some point be able to transport. Everybody has to abide by the CON rules, and in order to do that, you have to be able to
Agree.
have the capital to be able to transport the patients, the assets to be able to transport.
But it's not like a mutual aid where whoever's closer gets it. It doesn't work that way. Okay. Thanks. That helps a lot. It's just a little confusing.
No, it is.
And, I had the same question as Sherry. I'm trying to figure if you've got three people covering the same area, and then who makes the final determination, who's going to make that call? It's the first one that gets there. Is there specific lines drawn across the city that says you're covering this quadrant, you're covering this quadrant, you're covering this quadrant? And then if you can't agree, what if the other two say, hey, I want to be primary, and then the other one comes in? Is there a higher power that's going to decide who's primary, who's secondary?
And I'll give you an example that's going on right now. City of Surprise has submitted their CON application, and they've come to an agreement with Southwest Ambulance Rural Metro to almost divide their city up into a third and two-thirds. So Southwest Ambulance has agreed to cover one-third of the city by jurisdictional boundary, street level, and then the other two-thirds is what City of Surprise would cover. So there has to be an agreement with all the vendors to come to an agreement about how the calls will be covered. The backup calls, so not just the primary call, but the secondary call, who provides that backup? And that would be done through a mutual aid agreement through the other vendors.
Well, I have all kinds of questions, but I'm trying not to jump ahead of what you have here. But if there's 4 different entities covering our city.
No.
Okay, maybe I'm not getting that.
For instance, right now, today, as we sit at
Southwest Ambulance.
20 minutes to 6,
Right.
we have one vendor that can actually meet the requirements of that response time.
Right,
And
okay.
that's Southwest Ambulance
Okay.
Rural Metro. If we said to AMR, you need to start covering calls, they couldn't. They don't have the
Gotcha.
resources to
Okay.
be able to do that.
And then these other entities.
We don't know. What my sense is from knowing the owner of Priority Ambulance is they're going to go after the same thing that AMR is going after, which is a county-wide CON coverage. They don't have it down to the specifics of Goodyear.
Yeah.
We would actually have it down to the specifics of Goodyear, our north-south boundaries, our east-west boundaries, and be very specific about how we're going to cover that and where we're going to cover that. And our application would be judged on such. AMR's is a Maricopa County-based CON.
Mm-hmm.
It just so happens we sit in Maricopa County. But if we ask them to start covering, if something catastrophic happened to rural metro tonight, AMR wouldn't be able to start covering that for a while. They don't have the assets. So it's a little bit of a misnomer to how they hold the CON and how they provide that coverage. But state statute says they have to be able to meet their response times of that.
But we wouldn't even be ready if Southwest Ambulance.
We are actually we have an agreement.
We don't have our own ambulance.
No, but we have an emergency agreement in place with Buckeye Valley Fire
Okay.
District to be able to
Okay.
provide that coverage in a matter of hours. So
Okay. All right. I'll hold off on my other ones.
Just note, Councilmember Campbell is now at the meeting.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
okay, the next part I'm going to turn it over to Gabe to begin their work on the study.
All right, Mr. Mayor and Council, you guys, as Chief has already discussed what our scope was and what our team did on the study. One thing that's important to understand is not only is the process of getting into the ambulance business, the certificate of necessity regulated by the state, but the rates and the fees that you charge for that service is also regulated by the state. So part of our analysis was to determine what is that reasonable rate that the city of Goodyear could charge for its ambulance services in one of the two different scenarios, whether they took over all the 911 calls within the city boundaries, or whether they just took over the ALS calls. And so what we ended up doing is using the current base rate of Southwest Ambulance Rural Metro as our starting point. And as we get into the financials, you'll see that it does provide a narrow margin for the city, which is within the statute for DHS's requirements. One of the other things we had to do, it's always important, is ambulance billing. If you bill, for example, $100 for an ambulance transport, you don't necessarily get paid $100. The ambulance reimbursement is regulated both by Medicare and Access. Medicare sets a rate, which is a fixed amount, and then Access currently by statute is 68.59% of your state-approved base rate. So in order for us to determine how much money the city would actually bring in under its own ambulance transportation program, we had to determine what that payer mix is for the city of Goodyear. We did that by taking essentially census data as well as data for other CON holders with similar demographics and coming down and developing that comparison and that percentage of Medicare patients, of Access patients, of self-pay and private insurance patients. So we can then calculate out our correct settlements and then get a net revenue or net collection from the operation.
When you were doing this, did you also take into scenarios where possibly changes to Obamacare or changes to our state access or Medicare system changes, how that would impact how we actually got paid?
Right.
If those, because unfortunately those could be changes we could potentially see.
Correct. There's a lot of unknowns. The scope of this study didn't have us get into those areas. We really looked at it from the standpoint of if the city got in today, as well as given the current environment, what that would look like in the 5-year trend. So we did not take into account.
Current environment.
Correct.
Okay.
So there has been movement on the change of the state approval rate for Access. There's a reduction from the 68%. Are you familiar with that?
No, it was actually up at 72%. It was reduced to the 68.59%. So that's the reduction that was just voted on this past budget that they passed.
Okay, so that's the figure that you use, not the 72?
Correct, yes.
Okay.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
Okay. So with that, we could go to the next one. Oh, it's okay. So again, we took it, the first model was looking at the city providing both ALS and BLS transportation services. In order to do that, the city would have to staff 4 ambulances. 2 would be staffed essentially 24/7, 365 days, and then there would be 2 peak demand, or when the call volume's higher, you would have 2 more units in service to be able to handle the additional demand. In order to do that, the city would have to hire 19 new staff members, which are paramedics and EMTs, as well as a EMS manager to help oversee and manage just the ambulance operation specifically. In addition, the cost for essentially equipment that the city would need to purchase, in addition to obviously the hiring of people, a fully loaded ambulance, meaning the ambulance itself and all the equipment to go into it and stock it, is right around $200,000, depending on the specific model that the city would look at purchasing.
Go ahead.
I have a question on that. Really 2 questions. The first is, what is the difference between the ALS and the BLS in call volume that we've experienced? I mean, what are our going percentages or trends that we have? And then looking on down, you may cover this later, what is the difference? Because it looks like there's more in the one ambulance or more personnel, or how's the difference between the 2?
So currently, based on our estimates and based on the call data that we received from the chief, out of the 3,500 calls per year, 2,500 are ALS and about 1,000 are BLS. The difference between the 2 models is we're able to reduce some of the staffing because we're not running 3,500 calls. If the city just looked at the ALS model, they're only running 2,500 calls. So you didn't need 4 ambulances in the system to cover that call volume and meet the response times that the chief was talking about earlier.
Go ahead. Wait. Oops. Hold on. Councilmember Stipp.
So and maybe I wait to the next slide, but You talk about the personnel costs being roughly 1.5 million, I think,
Correct.
and divide that by the 19 new employees. That gives us an average of about 75,000 per employee, including benefits. If we look at the number that we heard a couple of weeks ago from the Public Works Director, that we pay 139,000, but the position was really going to cost us 270 something. If 75,000 per employee is total, including benefits, that means if we take that figure by half, we're kind of in the neighborhood of 35 and some change per employee, which doesn't seem to be in the market. And we just got done having a whole discussion a couple weeks ago about getting our employees to market and all the rest of that. Larry, can you talk a little bit about what salary figures we use to come up with that number? Because I personally believe it's a little low.
As far as this goes, they provided that with information that they received from us looking at the relative scales. But on the one that you're referring to on the Public Works Director, as I recall, I don't have that in front of me, but there was a purchase of a vehicle that was about $30,000 that was included in there. There were certain one-time costs and other direct related costs. These positions being more line costs, they did include, I believe they included as part of this, the uniform part and so forth, that would be part of the cost. But the actual benefit costs would be our health insurance and so forth. As a percentage, it'd be a fairly high percentage because the dollars are lower. But I believe you got the information from our current plan.
Correct. Yes.
Okay, and that included ASRS and
Correct.
so we're really talking about roughly though $40,000 a year per employee.
Depending on whether it's a paramedic or an EMT, yes, it's the 40,000 a year. But understand we derive that hourly rate from market research on current rates within the valley and actually took the higher of the average. So City of Goodyear would actually still be one of the higher payers on civilian paramedic and EMTs in the valley based on our analysis.
Councilman Campbell? Then I'll go to you, sure.
Well, I'm glad we're finally having this discussion because 10 years ago I had this discussion with our fire chief when I was on the Public Safety Committee. And our committee wanted to know why Goodyear Fire at that time was not running their own ambulance service. And I come from a family where my children put themselves through college being paramedics for AMR.
Right.
So I understand both ends of the perimeter. However, what I would like to ask is of the 2,500 advanced life support calls and the 1,000 basic life or basic support, are those the total number of calls that were run in the City of Goodyear and just the City of Goodyear, and we're not counting our fire personnel and our paramedics answering outside our city limits because we're just talking about us?
Correct. We looked at just transports. That 3,500 is just transports within the boundaries of the city, and that is it. So,
All right, because that's really not a lot for a city of 75,000 people when you stop and think about it.
Right.
If that's all it is for a year. And you think 4 ambulances would do it?
Yes. Yes, we looked at a unit hour utilization and verified that, and also worked with the chief on the staffing model and the station location and deployment, and do feel that the 4 units is adequate to cover.
And they could be housed in existing fire stations. So we wouldn't have an additional cost of having to build a garage to put a
No.
ambulance in. Okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
Councilmember Loretano?
I have 2 questions. When we're looking at some of the salaries, do we somehow incorporate the savings? Because right now, doesn't one of our staff one of our fire personnel goes in the ambulance, right?
Mm-hmm.
To the hospital.
Yeah, there would be instances still where 2 medics would be needed on those calls. So we, from a crew standpoint, we would still ask that continue, that a double medic on chest pain patient and cardiac arrest, drowning, that those patients would get a double paramedic. So 1 off the engine and 1 from the ambulance.
Okay, and then the other question would be how does this work with Mobile? Since right now how are you figuring that in? Are we not? I'm just curious.
That is a very good question, and it is certainly a footnote that we have to certainly consider when we would negotiate with Southwest Ambulance, whether we continue to get service out of Maricopa to cover Mobile, or whether we look for a different deployment model for those two personnel down in Mobile. That's certainly something that we'd work through with the city manager's office and also a vendor as well.
Okay.
Councilmember Osborne.
So, okay, you answered the Mobile question. How does, a couple of questions I have is, this won't be considered an enterprise fund, correct? Or will it be?
It is our
will- it will
intent
be
that
in-
we would
okay.
treat it as an enterprise fund.
Thank
at
you.
this point.
All right. How does this work with our liability and increase to liability coverage? You know, obviously, when a paramedic is in someone's home taking care of them, I don't know how much more you have to increase because now you're on your own, in your own ambulance. You know, all of those factors. I'm thinking outside of what are we missing anything that we're not thinking about for the future? I mean, then, you know, further down the line, we're also going to have to talk about, you know, the CIP and where we're continuing to bring in new ambulances, maintaining those ambulances, things like that I'm looking at. And so I'm glad the enterprise fund question was one, but how does this also work with our Litchfield Park contract, and back to work with the liability of this all?
If I can answer the first part of that liability question for you, is the liability wouldn't change on the care of the patient. That remains the same. The liability would have to ensure that we're insured on the ambulance transport, the actual ride to the hospital, but that would be covered under the vehicle's insurance, that liability piece. But the care of the patient doesn't really change, from what we do currently. From Litchfield Park, the way the state sees the CON is the CON grows as the city grows. So if we annexed more land, we wouldn't have to go back. We would just have to update our maps on the CON to show as the city expands. But for us to
annexing Litchfield, that's what it sounds like.
But for Litchfield Park, we would still use Southwest Ambulance for those transports.
You would, okay,
Yeah.
all righty.
Councilmember Stipp.
So, Larry, I'm going to ask a very obvious question. So when the enterprise fund doesn't generate enough money, how do we pay for the balance? The general fund, correct?
That would be correct, but that's also part of why you're getting this presentation tonight, to see all of it. The concept on the enterprise fund, more than anything, is the concept you're seeing tonight, which is looking at it standalone and the impact to us today. And that's really what the important part of it is, because you're absolutely right. The enterprise fund has no revenue authority outside of what you're seeing today.
Right. So if it's losing money, the general fund is
Has to be
supplementing
picked
it.
up. Yep.
So that part becomes irrelevant, almost.
And just for myself, further clarification, the fees you can charge are set. So even if you're not making enough money, you can't increase fees. It just doesn't work that way. It's set by state, et cetera, correct?
Well, the one thing is, let's say the city is not doing as well as it projected. It can go for what's called a general rate increase, where you submit your financials to Department of Health Services. You show them where essentially the costs have risen higher than what you anticipated, and you can request a higher rate than at that point. And it's relatively typical. You guys are outside of what's called the Phoenix Unified Rate Group, which pretty much most of the private ambulance as well as the city of Phoenix is in one rate group. So if one of those providers wants a new rate, they all essentially submit their financials and get a new rate. You guys are outside of that, so it'd purely be upon the city to make a decision whether or not the annual deflator, DHS does give you an annual deflator that keeps in line with inflation, and your rate does increase year over year. But if for whatever reason those costs exceeded that, then the city could, like I said, go for that general rate increase and request a higher rate.
Councilman Campbell.
In checking your net revenue figures, what is the loss ratio for those that you transport that have no insurance and cannot pay and do not pay?
So on the figures here, as you'll see, the settlements there are essentially what is not collectible. The access settlement and Medicare settlement, those are those adjustments I spoke to earlier. Now your bad debt, your 820,000, excuse me, the 820,000 is that percentage of these are patients that aren't going to pay us, and we're just not going to see the money. And that's reflected on there. And that's 26% of your net collectible.
That's high.
That is,
I thought everybody had to have insurance.
I will say our analysis actually shows that City of Goodyear actually has a much better payer mix than a lot of the other CONs that we've looked at in the comparison. So I would say you actually, it sounds bad, but I mean, you're actually in better position than a lot of other areas.
Okay.
Hold on, Councilmember Stipp.
Okay, so I was looking ahead to make sure that you weren't going to cover it, and I think we're going to move on. So I'm going to pepper you with the rest of my financial questions. Then, if so, at this point in this model, we show no capital reinvestment, if you will. The ambulances that we're purchasing are going to need to be replaced, more than likely within the 5-year window that you've put together in this projection, but yet there's no capital outlay to replace at least even one of those ambulances.
There actually is, when on this allocation for city support services, one of the things I include in there is essentially a depreciation expense on those ambulances using a 5-year life. So there is that fund being developed for capital replacement.
Okay, so that's built in there.
Yes.
And then the other question, and I had a hard time discerning from the actual study component that we got. It appeared as though you used the 2010 census data for demographics. Is that correct?
So yes, the 2010 is the most recent census data out there.
Right.
However, we did pull actually information from the city's planning and economic section to kind of project where the city's at now and going forward.
From a demographics?
From a demographic standpoint.
Okay. So I noted that you used 2.5% as a growth for Medicare. And I'm not trying to play gotcha.
No. Are you talking about on the settlements? Oh, so what we did on the increase. Yeah, there's a 2.5% increase year over year on the revenue side. And that's that annual deflator by DHS.
Okay. But did you include in 2010, everybody who was 65 and under, it's like the game with the coins. When the coin drops, people keep falling off the ledge and they fall into Medicare.
Right.
So if in 2010 we had a huge population of under 65, but in 2015 we have a much larger population of people turning 65, they're falling into the Medicare. So our private pay group, which was enormous in 2010, is shrinking. And that's only assuming that they're falling off that end of the scale as quickly as they're coming in on the backside. And I don't know how we're able to adequately determine that.
Right, and I think you said it right there. It's relatively difficult to actually determine what that change is, because as the population is aging, your call volume is going to this aging population, but you also have new people coming into a younger population, and so we didn't. We assumed for the purpose of the study that it would essentially, for the most part, balance and not have as great of impact as some may think.
And I think that becomes normal when we talk about the young population moving in. The 20-somethings and the 30-somethings with the young families. They're not necessarily utilizing this service as much as because I'm there, in the over 50 range, we're utilizing those services more. So I don't know that there's a proportion of over 50 versus that younger group that's coming together. But what I'm concerned about is our uncharacteristic, I think is the way you described it, payer mix that we have a lot of private pays, and I'm going to be very, very blunt. The people in Pebble Creek are very well off, and they're under 65.
Yeah.
And they all have very good health insurance. So when they need to go to the hospital, they've got a great health insurance that's doing it, that's paying for it. But the minute that those people who have that great insurance turn 65, what I'm hearing is they're all jumping to Medicare.
Well, we are, but I also carry 2 other private pay, so I've
Right.
got 3 insurance policies.
Yeah,
so
everyone's
I'm totally
keeping a
covered.
supplemental, but
Yeah.
the bulk of your
Oh,
payment
you have to go to Medicare. You don't
is
have a
going to
choice.
Medicare, exactly. So if we're experiencing this great phenomena of private pays, those private pays are eventually that number's going to shrink and maybe get back to what you might typically say is normal. So once we achieve normal, will we still have this same revenue stream? I guess is what I'm driving at. If with 2 active adult communities who will be using this service more, I'm afraid that we're going to stick our neck out pretty far, and that's the group that's going to end up using it, and we're going to end up having a higher access in Medicare revenue than we're anticipating in a smaller. Is that a reasonable, potentially reasonable? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but potentially reasonable.
You know, I think I would say yes, but at the same time, I think what you're going to realize is that percentage, that flip is going to be relatively negligent to the entire financial, the financials, the entire payer mix of what the city is going to be billing. You're right. You are going to start maybe potentially you will see an older, more aging population come in. But again, I still feel there's transient populations. There are a lot of other 911 calls and transports that originate from outside of the retirement communities. And I don't see the city of Goodyear becoming a Sun City or a Sun Lakes.
We're not.
And then, that's where we would be concerned. You would see a rather large shift, and we would see 80-90% Medicare. But again, I don't think the city of Goodyear is going to, in my opinion, is going to get that far to where it's going to throw the numbers off greatly.
Go ahead.
My question, I just was talking with my fellow council member. Does Obamacare cover transport? Do you know? Or is it the individual insurance policy that does that?
Correct. It's the insurance policy.
Okay, so does Medicare cover transport?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
But that's at a lesser fee, is it not? Yeah,
Correct.
that's the catch-22. That's the thing, that you may have other policies, but they don't necessarily cover the full cost that you were hoping to recover. And as the shift goes from 100% coverage to 68% coverage, that leaves a hole.
Right. And just a nomenclature correction, the 68% is access or Medicaid. Medicare, actually, the current reimbursement rate's $492 for ALS and BLS, $361.
And what's the current rate? Is that the current rate?
That's what they're paying. Currently, the model's based off a rate of $983 for an ALS and $914. Yes, roughly 50%.
Just one general comment. When I look at this from a income statement standard, and I see after depreciation only, you have a margin of 0.28%. That's less than 1%. And I think about when I've done some of these things with sensitivity analysis, what if I'm off 10% plus or minus? You got no margin there. So just a thought, maybe I don't want to go into the details now. Maybe offline talk to you about some of your numbers, but I'm concerned with that margin being as tight as it is. Okay? So.
Yeah,
I agree.
But go ahead. We don't have to start right at 6, but I want to keep us.
Okay. Yeah, and I think I'll speak to that real quick on the margin real quick. Is that 0.28 is after the allocations?
I understand that.
And there's expenses such as dispatch in there, the fire chief's salary. A lot of them are expenses in that 438 that's currently borne by the city, or as we discussed, that capital replacement fund. So it's not the actual cash in of the operation.
No, I understand that, but when you're looking at an income statement, it's not always cash. It's accrual
Correct.
method, so what you've
Correct.
earned and incurred. So.
Correct. The next model that we looked at is the ALS only, as the chief discussed. It would be a contract with a private provider to provide the BLS transports. In this model, we're looking at 2 24/7 units and 1 peak demand. And again, it would be looking at 17 staff members to actually staff the ambulances, and then an EMS manager. And again, on the financials here, what has changed is we've pulled out all the BLS calls as well as reduced personnel wages and related expenses for having that essentially 1 less ambulance on the road, and any costs related to those calls. And as you can see, that margin decreases greatly when the city looks at just the ALS only option. There's a lot of revenue because unfortunately you can't cut back any more than those 3 ambulances. And the call volume's really, relatively low for those 3, but because of land size and everything, it's important to have those 3. And finally, status quo. As the chief discussed, currently the city receives reimbursement for ALS transports that the city's paramedic rides in, firefighter paramedic rides into the hospital. Over the last 2 years, that's averaged about $145,000 a year. And so what that doesn't cover, though, and it's important to note, is there's no allocated costs on that $145,000. So we're not allocating anything for the firefighters' wages and time like we did on the full ALS and BLS models. But did feel that it was important that the city knows that, and council knows that is money currently coming into the city that it doesn't have any increased staffing for, but there is no cost allocated to that.
Any questions? Oh, no, one more. Go
And the
ahead.
$145,000, I'm sorry, Joe.
No, go ahead.
The $145,000 cost, say that again, what you just said. I mean, that's something we pay out to?
It's income.
Oh, it's income. Thank you, because I didn't understand that slide at all.
Payments from our vendor, so income.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so essentially what we did is we looked at the 3 different models. Obviously, the ALS, BLS option allows the city to have greater span of control, continuity of care, and ensure quality patient care. Obviously, there's a lot of financial matters that must be addressed with any business endeavor, and essentially this is what it is. It's a business endeavor for the city to look at. Our purpose of our study was to give council a kind of a clear understanding of the financial aspect of getting into the ambulance operation. Our study also covers some of those costs for the application process, as well as what's needed for initial financing on the assets, as well as typically from when you start transporting, when you start receiving your first payments, is about 4 to 6 months. And so our analysis also included what the cash flow was going to be needed from the city to fund the operation during that initial period while payments are not being received. And with that, I will turn it over to Larry.
Okay, we wanted to just review with you what if we wanted to move forward. And so some of these costs that we're going to talk about, all of these numbers came out of the report. We're going through the process, but right to start with, and you've already asked the questions and you've seen it. The business model that you saw, when you get down to the margins, this is not something that you would probably do seeing an opportunity to make money. That would not be your motivation to do it. It would be to make sure that the service was provided in the community. And that's an underlying assumption that we've made in these next few slides. So the cost of the application, taking the high end of the numbers we're showing there, just the application itself would cost about $70,000. And with that hasn't been a hearing. That's just getting the application up there, preparing the proposed CON and that type of thing. Then the next phase, and this is all part of that 450 days that was in there, that next phase would be an administrative hearing, and that's where the cost can get quite expensive, as you're seeing there. So you add those up, you could, with expert consultant fees, total be between $400,000 and $500,000. As most of you know, I hope you do anyway, we've just gone through a budget process and this hasn't come up. And so, how would we fund that? If you go to the next slide. So we've talked a bit in.
Hold on, Larry.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bill.
Larry, you pulled those, can you go back one slide?
Yeah.
You pulled those legal counsel fees out of the report?
Out of the,
okay.
Yes.
I'm working with a client right now that is embarking on a defense of a C event. The attorney that we are using in defense of that has talked about the costs associated for the applicant when they're going forward, when it's being contested, which we would assume ours will be contested by at least one, if not both of our providers. The average rate that the people applying for those C of Ns, we were informed, is between $600,000 and $800,000 a year in legal fees, between the legal fees and the special audits and proving your financial stability, which is way off of $100,000 to $350,000, and that's a today number. So I don't know if we're using, and I don't want to challenge the numbers, and I'm certainly not inferring that, but if we're off. Let's just say it's 350 and greater. This number is a lot larger than $400,000. So I think we need to include that as part of this discussion. Now I don't know if you've got any comment on the legal fees.
Yeah. So the only comment I'll add to that is you're right. I mean the cost can range up to. I mean, City of Yuma paid right around $1 million for theirs. I think there's some things to take note, though. The City of Yuma didn't pay $70,000 up front to make sure the application was done properly and done defensively. So that obviously helps kind of a lot of that on the back end. But essentially, this quote up here of $100,000 to $350,000 is actually what one of the firms in the Valley, who represents most of the municipalities, is actually currently negotiated with for most of their fees on them. So they've started doing them, capping the fees on these depending on the success or non-success of the CON.
Okay.
So, but I will say that $700. There's also those expert fees that could get pretty high.
It's a sliding scale.
Yes.
And it definitely slides to the right more than it does to the left. I'm just making the observation.
The question I have is, say you get all this done and you have one individual that already has the what do you call it, CON, and you've got it. Now you've got to come to an understanding with that individual who covers what. What if the person doesn't want to give up anything? I'm just doing hypotheticals here. Who steps in and mitigates that? Because now you have one, they have one, and they're saying, I'm not giving up anything. I want primary. You're saying I want primary. What happens then?
I would say that it goes through DHS. It's through DHS and at the state level, and you could even to the point where it hasn't been done yet, to my knowledge, but it could even be contested in court. That who essentially has, like the question earlier, who has the right to the calls.
And that could expand that 350 even more.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Go on, Larry.
So what we talked about is how would we pay for this? And there's a couple of concepts in this. One is obviously this is just hitting you tonight, not expecting direction to move forward on a tomorrow basis or what have you. But the timing of an application would take a while to put the whole CON together. And the assumption is that wouldn't even start until somewhere, the December, January range. And so therefore, the main cost that would hit us over the next 12 months would be just the cost of the CON application. We did, as we were going through the fiscal year 15, we kind of had mentally set aside, not anything else, because we hadn't seen any numbers, at about $100,000 on the city manager contingency for fiscal year 15. However, I think our intent would be that if indeed we did decide to go forward with this, that savings that we realized in other areas throughout the year might be the source of paying that rather than that particular money. The phase 2 costs, which are the actual cost of defending and so forth, the assumption would be that we would include that in the fiscal year 17 budget. The next slide, if you would, because this is also where the numbers start to get large. And this came out of the report also. And more than anything, whether these numbers are, because I don't want to go through right now and, the level of detail, but Gabe mentioned the 6 months operating that you have to assume before you start receiving the cash for the services. So that's kind of a startup cost. How do you get that cash? And then the ambulance purchases in doing those. And as you can see, those costs for the full service would be close to $2 million, $1.5 million the other way. The concept is that we talked about would be to include those possibly, and go ahead and go to the next slide, as a loan from the general fund, or we could consider outside financing. We would also on the ambulances, because part of what you have to have is backup ambulances. You don't run that service and then have one down getting its oil changed while there's a call, obviously. But you might be able to defer a backup ambulance, to time that cash flow over a couple of fiscal years. So those are kind of the options that we've thrown out as to how we would deal with that. As you saw on those returns and on the margins, the payback coming to the general fund would not be something that we would expect to come back very quickly. I believe what we talked about on that loan, if I remember right, Gabe, was 10 years.
Correct, we did 10-year amortization.
10-year amortization to get that capital back over a period of time. Just to give you a model, the key in what we were looking at when we had that discussion is we really didn't want to gloss this over to say, hey, here, I'm selling cars or what have you. We didn't want to give you an impression that we could just walk into this and do it easily. It'd be a serious commitment to move forward on it.
Do you have? Yeah. Go ahead.
So just thinking future if we do continue down this route. And, I certainly for the last quite a few years have always asked, why don't we have our own, ambulance service? I've always been intrigued by the notion of it and thinking that it was right for our citizens. But looking at the numbers, I have to balance that back and forth. But going out into the future, it really came to me at a head when Southwest Ambulance was having all the difficulties. And it certainly made more sense that we should be, looking at this. But if we're really looking at this not fully into play for 2 years, 2017, by the time we have to go to defend that we want to do this, and we're talking about all the, everything we just spoke about with the possible attorney fees and things like that to defend why we want to do this, I guess you could always be concerned that that risk gets worse for us because, in 2 years, Southwest Ambulance or whomever may have a better picture to be arguing over than they currently have. And so, I'm thinking, hypotheticals everywhere as to what does this mean? What does that mean? I guess we just always have to do that. What does that mean to us? But that is a possibility, I suppose, that we won't look as good as we look right now 2 years from now.
And I think the financial picture for the private vendors will be as difficult as it is for the government vendors as well. So in 2 years, there will probably be some changes. We'll also have, right around that time, a change of the presidency. So does Obamacare stay? Does it go out?
Right.
So there's a lot of unknowns out there. And I think it was important for us in talking with the city manager for a while about this idea is that we really did have a good look at the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
We always had an understanding of where we were at and that we did have a strong payer mix within the community, but really what was it? And I think for the first time, we've now had a good intensive look at that, at that process. So.
Councilmember Stipp.
So it's round numbers, $2 million to get the thing off the ground, not including what we're going to have invested to get there, correct? Right. And in 2017, roughly. 3 weeks ago, we sat here and debated about roadway projects that are being deferred to 2017, and other projects that are being pulled from the CIP, and here's a brand-new project that we're looking to add. So I just encourage my fellow council members to carefully consider what does that look like as well, because this $2 million is not going to materialize as brand-new money coming out of somewhere. This is going to take away from something else, and we need to be prepared for that. The other obvious, at least I hope it's obvious, is if Southwest Ambulance can't make this go, and this is what they do for a living, why? We have to go into this knowing that this is a loser right from the beginning, and that gets back to the question that was asked earlier. If we're going to pretend that this is an enterprise account, we need to pretend that we're going to supplement it with general fund money, because there will always be a general fund drain on this enterprise account. And I don't know that there's any way around it. And I would look to our consultants with the rule of thumb on productivity for ambulances is about 4.5 calls per day to make them break even. And if you look at our numbers by the number of ambulances we're going to have, that gives us an average of about 3 and some change. So we will set up a model that will not even break even when we at 4 rescues or 4 ambulances. So this is I realize we're not making any decisions today, but there's a lot of other facts that really need to come into our decision, other than our desire to internalize our service delivery. I mean, and I don't want to diminish that, because that's a big deal as well.
I think if I could, just on the enterprise fund, I don't want you focusing that much on it. The concept that I had when I said that we would do this in an enterprise fund is so that we don't blend it in with our existing services, that you don't see what that is. And that's the real concept I was looking at, is the transparency portion. If it's in its own fund, you can see that it will, or whatever it's costing you to do it. If we just blend it within the fire department, it just becomes a bigger part of that one pie, but you really don't see it that way.
And I can agree, and I can appreciate that, because if you're going to set it up, you might as well know what it's costing you, just like the stadium.
Well,
yeah.
And making sure that it's set up with consistency year after year. I mean, we had this problem with the ballpark.
Right.
We know we still continue to feed it from the general fund, but there was always, in the police department overtime or in the fire department. I mean, there was always a lot of numbers that weren't, it's like, show us the full picture, regardless how ugly it may look. We need to know the full picture. So very last question, hypothetically, 5 years from now, or, let's say 7 years from now, starts in 2017, 7 years from now, we say, you know what? This is just costing us far too much money. Is there always we'll go back with the other guys? Or is this it? We're doing it and we're stuck with it? Is this, a forever business? Tell me.
It's hard to go back. I think once you have the CON and you're operating in that, it's very difficult to give that up, because what happens to the private vendors? They're going to leave to go find a revenue source for themselves.
How does this work? Okay.
Sorry.
I was going to ask you, how does this work with the areas of, and you were probably going to answer me this, but we have those county islands within our city. I mean, if you're saying they're gone, who's picking up some of these?
Well, I guess that was my very next point. It was the other could happen, certainly, is both of the private vendors said, you know what, we're really not interested in doing this. Good luck. And they did that in Southwest Ambulance. Rural Metro did that in Indiana. They left, how many cities in the lurch, and they have to now find ambulance transports for themselves. So we could be forced into the business at some point in time. We don't know how that will be. I think it's good that we look at it now, and I'm certainly passionate about providing that level of service to us. But I think it's smart of us to look at it now and really see what the impact would be if, in the event, we have to jump into it.
There's no doubt. I agree with that.
I just look at this from a the standpoint, if I were given these numbers and asked to finance this business, is this something I would be interested in doing? And I don't think my answer would be in the positive because the risk is very one-sided. So I would take some convincing for sure, because I know that if I were asked to finance this, it wouldn't happen.
One more, Sherry, and then city manager. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do appreciate that you brought this to us because I think it is something that we do need to talk about. And I think from after what happened with, Rural Metro and everything, that there have been concerns. And I appreciate you wanting to keep the highest level of service for our citizens. Some of the finances, I think we do have to look at it. It's like it's not going to be a money-making operation and everything. And I don't know what our window is, if we're going to do it now before others come in or if we do it later. I guess I still need some more information, but I appreciate the information you have brought us. I'm still a little like the Mobile question, the County Island question. Is this something we could do in agreement with Litchfield Park like we did for fire service? I mean, I guess I have a lot more questions, but it was a very good presentation, a lot of information.
For the city manager, before you start, where do you want from us as we kind of go forward, or is this just like the prelim to a future salvo somewhere else down the road? Go ahead.
Mayor and members of the council, that's exactly where I was going to conclude. Excuse me. This was really to get the information in front of you. We are not taking any action as staff right now. I want to be very clear that it's good to get the numbers out, both good, bad, and we've talked about level of service. We've talked about the financial impact. What I would propose, and I know we're not voting on this as a council, but trying to get direction, is we'll continue to monitor the industry, if you will. We'll also, I think it's important to look at the levels of service that we're getting from the current providers to see if there's a shift in that and some of those types of things. The one question I would ask council is, are there any specific items, and I have heard quite a bit of discussion as well, anything specific that you would want from staff to deliver back to you? Because at this time we're not, obviously, it's not in the budget. We will be going back through the budget process. We do tentative budget adoption next Monday. And certainly this isn't something we're trying to force. The timing on this was such where the study just got completed. We were going through it, so it didn't have an opportunity to be as far as the front part of the budget. So knowing all those complexities and the timing of this, I really would want to know the interest of council. Is this something you want us to continue to look at? Is there more information that you would like? And we'll take it from there.
Thoughts?
I've got one question, if I may ask, and I'm sorry. You might have covered this, Chief, before I came in. Would our boundaries only be for Goodyear, and we would not be part of an automatic aid to anybody?
No, we would have a mutual aid agreement
So
with
we
other ambulances in the event that they were out, but we would also have that same reciprocal agreement with them. So, for instance, I'll use our neighbors to the west, Buckeye Valley Fire Department have their own CON. We would have a mutual aid agreement with them. If our ambulances were tied up, we could bring them in, but also the reverse would happen the same way.
And then we would get reimbursed if we ran that call,
Oh yeah,
not
yeah. That
them.
transport would be reimbursed by us, to us. Sorry.
Okay. And has there been any discussion, not necessarily for Goodyear, but with other fire departments who run their own ambulance service? Do they ever do a subscription service for the folks that are in the county island or folks that are really, even Mobile?
Yeah, Peoria is actually looking at a subscription service, but for their fire calls.
Oh.
That has not been discussed yet from an ambulance standpoint that I'm aware of.
I only know of a few fire districts that are charging subscriptions and essentially it waives the copay. But it's actually just for the district residents, though. It's not, or people outside.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with that because my mother subscribed to have an ambulance come to where she was living because there was no service.
Right.
And she paid a fee,
Yeah.
and that ensured that she would have a call.
Correct. Yep. And it is pretty popular in California as
That's
well. as
where she was.
subscriptions. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
One for the city manager, I think it would be helpful as we kind of go forward is, number one, the service level that's out there. Are we in a position where we could be caught short as a result of maybe people pulling out? I'd just like to know the climate of what's going on out there with the other service providers. I think that would be helpful. I don't know what the consensus with the group is here. Should we still keep getting more information? Yes, no?
I'm good getting more
Well,
information.
I think we need to, yeah.
Does that help you?
Yes, Mayor, what we can do is we'll continue to monitor the industry, what's happening in other municipalities, what's happening with the current vendors. So from that standpoint, we can absolutely provide those types of updates. If we see changes, we can certainly bring that to council quickly for considerations, but that's what I would propose.
Go ahead.
Like to be, I think, better informed on what the status or the situation with AMR is. They could not get a C of N unless they could provide this service. So they have to have something. And I know they've got vehicles in the area. I've seen them.
Yeah.
So we just get an update. I think we're up until this point, we've been very focused on what Southwest is able to provide because we right now have a contract with them. So we should also know what the other C of N holder is currently doing. If we can get that information, I think that would be helpful as well. And you said you are not including this in next week's tentative budget. Is that correct?
Let's put it this way. There is, if it would, it'd be in the manager's contingency is what we would be looking at. And that'd be for the phase one part of this. So it's really up to council whether you want that to be included in the budget for the phase one. We can have it budgeted. Again, it's manager's contingency up to $100,000. And we would not take action until such time as council would say, okay, please go ahead and take action. But understand that it is a lengthy process. I think we're talking a year and a half. So it is a while. So that in terms of the budget, that's what we would offer up is if we do go forward, it'd be out of the manager's contingency. For phase one, and not all of it. I just need to be specific. It's my contingency. Our contingency is not that
Nice
large.
contingency fund.
Contingency amount each year is $500,000, and that handles emergencies throughout the year. And so that's a maximum amount that's in there.
Would be helpful to me. Oh. There we go. I think follow-up information for me would be play this out for ongoing amounts. You know, what does it look like as we go, you know, for the future? Like we would see it as a normal budget for an enterprise fund. What is the ongoing amount? What do we suspect will be going into CIP? Lay it out because back to Bill's point, that $2 million is going to have to come from something. And so, you know, how does that play out? I just don't think some of those need to be answered before we can say, let's do it. Just on that end alone, financially.
Jerry.
And I get it. I would agree with that. I'd like to see where it's actually coming from, and as we grow, what our plan is, because I know we've got some questions about adding fire stations in Central Goodyear. How would the increased ambulance service in that area? And I don't know what the plan would be. Like right now, we keep one police unit up at EMR because we're so detached. Would we keep an ambulance station? Would be the plan then, I guess? Yeah. Okay. That was one of my other questions because we're kind of off the grid from everyone else.
Probably, yeah, definitely one north, one south. And then.
Okay. I'd just like to know what our growth plan is because we kind of have one with you with where the fire stations are going. So how would our ambulance service grow the same way?
Okay.
Go ahead.
And I don't even know if this is realistic, but is there any way of knowing what other cities that have their own CON is experienced and what the drain has been on their general fund?
We don't have very many.
It's
Pardon?
Yeah.
I'll answer that. So essentially, all the other cities, every ambulance organization within the state is required to submit an annual financial statement on a specific state-approved form. So you can look at those numbers. Unfortunately, they're not always clear on how they do their allocations as to what is what in there. And currently, we're actually working with another city that originally wanted us to go in and look at the specifics on how these other cities are doing it. It's really hard to get that information. Like, for example, City of Phoenix just doesn't provide the interfinancing of their ambulance operation, and they're one of the largest. So,
Go ahead.
But the only city in our region that has a C of N is Phoenix.
correct.
The other ones are fire districts.
Including Buckeye?
It's the Buckeye Valley Fire District
Yes.
that has the C of N. And the C of N goes from Goodyear's western boundary all the way out into La Paz and Yuma counties.
So it's not apples and apples.
It is absolutely not.
Correct.
And the only other C of N holders in the area are fire districts. So Daisy Mountain, Buckeye Valley, Sun City West are the three that have them. And then out east, it's Superstition just got one. And
Northwest Fire District.
Northwest Fire District, which is down around Tucson. So we don't have a fair comparison. There's a
The
number of
thought
applications.
comes to mind, why is that?
Did you get enough feedback?
Yes, we got enough feedback. You will see an item for the budget next week as far that it won't specifically outline, what we would be doing in CIP with this. We can certainly provide that over the course of the year. What I would suggest is up to council. But if we will, remember there's a manager's contingency, so if there's movement, a change in direction for us to go forward, at that point we would bring the entire financial package to you. But phase one would strictly come out of contingency, and that's how we would approach it and not look at budgeting after that for now.
Can I make a suggestion just for the other council members here? If we take the route on the contingency, then you don't have to worry about putting it into the budget because the money is there, and then they'd have to come up before the city council anyway. So, I mean, we can deal with that issue at another time. Does everybody feel comfortable with that?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
For information, council report, can we move that to the general meeting? Future meetings and that type of stuff? All right, great. 5 or 10 minutes, what do you think?
At least 5. It's going to take
10?
5 minutes
All
just to
right,
move
10
on.
minutes, we'll start back up the regular meeting, okay? Meeting